all the answers, just like, many religions look to God to hold all the answers, when I don't think you've acknowledged the limitations of science. Like, I'll be the first to pay homage to science and say of all the great things that it has done for humanity and advanced us, but at the same time, think about some of the flaws in scientific viewpoints, and things change. For a while there, we didn't believe the Earth was round. We believed the sun revolved around the Earth. Crazy things like that, where conventional science said things that later were proved to be, exactly, the opposite. Another more modern example, people, you have people like scientists regarding on food and stuff, them saying, oh, all these fats are bad, do a low-fat diet, do a low-carb diet.
Yeah.
You've got all these conflicting views all within the scientific community. So I think there's some really important limitations to science as well, because I don't think you can say all that there is to know and all that is valuable to know about morality and physics and the universe can be known through science because of the nature of the beings doing the science. And so my question is, do you think we can really progress this science as or morality as science in any meaningful way? Like, what, am I going to go and hire a group of scientists to go, should I go beat this person up or not? Will you guys go do some experiments for me and tell me if I should do this? Like science or morality as science, to me, doesn't give me any practical ways to live any differently. I don't gain anything meaningful that translates into life and decisions that you're making on a daily basis.
There's a lot of stuff there. So the first one was about science making mistakes and reversing itself. That happens. In some sciences, it happens more often than others. Right now, it's happening quite a lot in dietary science. The problem is that the other methods are even worse. So philosophy is even worse, and theology and astrology and thinking about the nature of the universe through the lens of New Ageism is just even way worse. So science is socially constructed. It is a human activity. It just turns out to be the one that works the best. And so I'm not saying we should just trust all of the deliverances of science as gospel or Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai. That's just the opposite of the scientific attitude. There is also, you talked about maybe science becoming a religion in that it's answering all of these questions that religion used to answer. And in particular, morality has been a central answer that religions have given and not science in the past. And so this is another threat from science in that way. I think you're correct that science probably can't answer all questions, but I think what I'm trying to do is, just because it's the most successful method, try to figure out ways to hand off the questions to science as much as possible, because it's the method that works. And so that's why, I'm trying to dissolve these endless semantic disputes and these endless disputes of intuition and find ways that we can answer particular questions with science, especially neuroscience in terms of brain states. Another issue is that when you talked about should I have scientists do experiments to tell me what I ought to do, again, remember though that we have to define what we mean by ought first in terms of things that exist in the real world, and then those claims are amenable to science. So you also asked how could science, the morality as a science, be useful to me? Let's say, just for the heck of it, that you were going to stick to your moral intuitions about what's morally right or wrong. And let's say you thought, I gave the example earlier, let's say you thought that pain was really morally bad. Science could show you that if you're going to be consistent with that view, with that value that you hold personally, then you shouldn't be eating factory farmed meat. That could be the case. And by the way, I'm using this example, I'm not even a vegetarian, so if I'm condemning anybody, I'm condemning myself. But so what I'm saying there is that science can go out and measure and figure out the things that correspond to the values that you already hold, and it might be useful to you in that way. I know that it has done that for me in the past, where I had wrong information about a particular scientific topic, and when I had the correct scientific information, I actually changed my views about how I should be responding to that situation. So that would be one way in which the science of morality could actually help you achieve just your own selfish goals or your own intuitions about what's right and wrong. Yeah?
My question is, do you think if we were able to use science as the way to prescribe moral truth to people, would that actually end up making a difference in any real-world problems, considering that humanity, regardless of where they get their moral standards from, tend to be able to violate it regardless?
I'll say, I mean, obviously there's so much horror in the world that it's easy to be a pessimist about moral value. I mean, this is the 21st century, and we still have women living lives of incredible oppression in Muslim countries all around the world, and even in first world countries in some cases. So it could be easy to be a pessimist. I am an optimist. Maybe it's just a decision, but I think about, for example, slavery. Slavery was accepted in most cultures around the world for thousands and thousands of years, and then suddenly, in the space of a few generations, most of the world rejected slavery as morally permissible. What happened there? Part of it was that we encountered the views of others. I think part of it was a lot of moral praise and condemnation. I think part of it was scientific research on how it's not correct that people of African descent are significantly, we weren't doing genetics back then, but significantly anatomically or in terms of brain capacity or brain ability, very different from, say, whites. So I could be totally wrong in my optimism, but I'm optimistic because if you take a long view of not the last 5 years, but the last 300 years, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. Yeah?
So if science tells us, let's suppose that we go out and we do this program and science tells us that, or we find that there is nothing like a categorical imperative, we only have hypothetical imperatives. Okay, let's assume that's true. So in that world, if I understand you correctly, it would be the case that if you want this particular end, that we can say something to you very certain about what you should do. If you desire to, like you were giving an example, go to dinner or whatever. Okay, but so let's take a more moral question rather than my trip to Fort Collins. You'd say, if you want to help humanity, then one of the best ways of doing that might be a doctor, right? But what about the case of a psychopath or a totalitarian dictator? Let's take the totalitarian to start with. Presumably, they don't want to help people, right? So you could say to him, well, if you want to help people, then you should do this, Mr. Totalitarian. He doesn't just come back to you and say, well, turns out I actually don't want to help people.
Right.
Now, doesn't that rob you, and maybe this is just the fact of the world that we live in, but doesn't that rob you or the moralist of any kind of bite or punch to be able to say to this dictator, no, actually, you should do this. Instead,
Right.
It seems like all we could say is, well, if you wanted to help everybody, you could.
Right. Yeah, if there's no categorical imperatives. That's an excellent question, because one of the things that we most want out of a moral theory is we have this idea that we would confront the psychopath who doesn't care about anybody else, and we would present this argument showing him that it's just wrong to be doing this. And then he would say, "You're right. Wow, it's a good argument. Wow, I guess I'll stop." That's something, I mean, that's a caricature, but something like that is what we really want out of a moral theory, that we can prove to somebody that what they're doing is wrong. And let's say it's the case that that's not possible. Well, what do we do then? This is actually really core to the moral theory that I do defend in detail elsewhere. is that when you're confronted with a psychopath, there are a couple different things you can do. You can appeal to his beliefs. So you can say, you can change his beliefs, and you can say, you can change his beliefs, and you can say, if you do this, a God will torture you in hell forever. And if you could trick him into thinking that that was true, you would change his behavior, and maybe he wouldn't be a psychopath anymore, or he wouldn't act like a psychopath. You can also change his desires. You could morally praise him for